Coco Gauff just broke down, and Alex Eala's name is written across every single reason why. The $50 million Adidas contract that was supposed to cement Gauff's commercial dynasty was redirected, restructured, and handed to a 20-year-old from Manila while cameras captured the precise moment Gauff's composure finally, publicly shattered. This wasn't a quiet backroom negotiation that leaked through anonymous sources weeks later. This unfolded in real time, documented, witnessed, and replayed across every sports media platform on Earth within hours of the moment it happened. A coronation interrupted, a corporation's loyalty exposed as conditional, a young American champion who had done absolutely everything right, discovering that doing everything right provides zero protection when something more powerful arrives and rewrites the commercial mathematics entirely. $50 million. Gone. Redirected. And the cameras were rolling when Gauff found out. What you are about to hear is not simply a story about sponsorship money or corporate strategy. It is a story about identity, vulnerability, the brutal weight of expectations placed on young Black women in professional sport, and the moment when the pressure of carrying an entire narrative finally became visible on one champion's face. Stay through every chapter, because the truth behind what broke Coco Gauff is more complicated, more human, and more important than any headline captured. She was never just a tennis player. From the moment a 15-year-old from Delray Beach, Florida, walked onto Wimbledon's center court and defeated Venus Williams, her childhood hero, the woman whose poster decorated her bedroom wall, Coco Gauff became something the sporting world assigns to perhaps one athlete per generation. She became a symbol. Not merely of athletic excellence, though that dimension was undeniable and extraordinary from her earliest professional appearances. She became a symbol of possibility, of what young Black excellence looked like when it arrived fully formed, articulate, confident, and completely unbothered by the weight of historical expectation pressing down from every direction simultaneously. She carried that weight with a grace that made observers forget how genuinely, crushingly heavy it must have felt. The commercial apparatus surrounding professional tennis recognized what they were witnessing before most casual fans had learned to spell her surname correctly. Brands do not wait for Grand Slam titles before they act on certainty, and Gauff represented commercial certainty of the rarest variety. The demographic crossover she achieved was unprecedented for a women's tennis player in the social media era. She spoke to tennis audiences and basketball audiences and fashion communities and political consciousness simultaneously. She wasn't marketing to multiple demographics. She was authentically embedded in all of them at once. Adidas understood this with particular clarity. The partnership they constructed with Gauff was not a standard apparel arrangement where a corporation attaches its logo to an athlete's existing identity. It was a collaborative, creative relationship, campaigns built around her specific aesthetic sensibility, her community voice, her cultural positioning as someone whose significance extended well beyond the baseline. Adidas marketing executives described the relationship internally as generational, a cornerstone investment designed to anchor their women's tennis strategy across an entire decade of competitive dominance. The financial architecture reflected that ambition. $50 million, structured across a multi-year commitment, represented one of the largest individual sponsorship arrangements in women's tennis history. It communicated with the unambiguous language of corporate investment that Adidas viewed Gauff not merely as an athlete to dress, but as a franchise to build their brand identity around. She earned every cent of that positioning. Her 2023 U.S. Open title, claimed with remarkable emotional composure in front of a roaring Flushing Meadows crowd, tears streaming as she processed becoming a Grand Slam champion on home soil, provided the competitive validation that completed her commercial profile. Ranking points confirmed what brands had already determined. Coco Gauff was the present and future face of American women's tennis. The endorsement portfolio expanded accordingly. New Balance footwear, New Era headwear, Wilson rackets, Barilla pasta in one of the most unexpectedly charming brand pairings in recent sporting history. Each edition reinforced a commercial ecosystem built on genuine cultural resonance rather than manufactured celebrity. She was 20 years old. She had a Grand Slam title. She had a $50 million Adidas relationship. She had a platform that most athletes spend entire careers unsuccessfully attempting to construct. Everything was precisely where it was supposed to be. And then, Alex Eala's numbers arrived on the right desk inside Adidas headquarters, and everything that had seemed permanent revealed itself as provisional. Because in the commercial architecture of global sport, no throne is load-bearing. Every arrangement, however generational it appears at signing, exists within a framework that responds to data. And the data that began accumulating around Alex Eala in 2025 did not politely wait for Gauff's contract cycle to complete before demanding attention. What happens when the corporation that built its women's tennis identity around you suddenly discovers it may have been building around the wrong foundation? What happens to the athlete who trusted that investment, who oriented her brand identity and commercial future around that partnership? What happens when $50 million becomes a question mark instead of a guarantee? Data doesn't negotiate. It doesn't consider feelings, histories, or the human cost of the conclusions it generates. It simply accumulates, organizes, and eventually reaches a threshold where ignoring it becomes professionally indefensible for anyone whose responsibility involves reading it honestly. The Adidas Analytics division reached that threshold sometime in the spring of 2025, and what their data presented to senior leadership was not a gradual trend suggesting a future consideration. It was an immediate, comprehensive, and commercially urgent realignment of their women's tennis opportunity landscape. Alex Eala's merchandise performance, already extraordinary in the Asia-Pacific markets that Adidas had identified as their primary growth frontier for the coming decade, had begun crossing boundaries that internal models had not projected occurring for years. European markets showed unexpected penetration. North American numbers, initially modest, were climbing with the kind of velocity that experienced analysts associate with cultural moment rather than standard athletic popularity growth. She was becoming embedded in cultures, in communities, in the daily social media consumption of demographics that Adidas had targeted for years without achieving meaningful penetration. Adidas understood this with particular clarity. The partnership they constructed with Gauff was not a standard apparel arrangement where a corporation attaches its logo to an athlete's existing identity. It was a collaborative, creative relationship, campaigns built around her specific aesthetic sensibility, her community voice, her cultural positioning as someone whose significance extended well beyond the baseline. Adidas marketing executives described the relationship internally as generational, a cornerstone investment designed to anchor their women's tennis strategy across an entire decade of competitive dominance. The financial architecture reflected that ambition. $50 million, structured across a multi-year commitment, represented one of the largest individual sponsorship arrangements in women's tennis history. It communicated with the unambiguous language of corporate investment that Adidas viewed Gauff not merely as an athlete to dress, but as a franchise to build their brand identity around. She earned every cent of that positioning. Her 2023 U.S. Open title, claimed with remarkable emotional composure in front of a roaring Flushing Meadows crowd, tears streaming as she processed becoming a Grand Slam champion on home soil, provided the competitive validation that completed her commercial profile. Ranking points confirmed what brands had already determined. Coco Gauff was the present and future face of American women's tennis. The endorsement portfolio expanded accordingly. New Balance footwear, New Era headwear, Wilson rackets, Barilla pasta in one of the most unexpectedly charming brand pairings in recent sporting history. Each edition reinforced a commercial ecosystem built on genuine cultural resonance rather than manufactured celebrity. She was 20 years old. She had a Grand Slam title. She had a $50 million Adidas relationship. She had a platform that most athletes spend entire careers unsuccessfully attempting to construct. Everything was precisely where it was supposed to be. And then, Alex Eala's numbers arrived on the right desk inside Adidas headquarters, and everything that had seemed permanent revealed itself as provisional. Because in the commercial architecture of global sport, no throne is load-bearing. Every arrangement, however generational it appears at signing, exists within a framework that responds to data. And the data that began accumulating around Alex Eala in 2025 did not politely wait for Gauff's contract cycle to complete before demanding attention. None of the underlying substance, when examined fully, justified the scale of the public exposure. Legal analysts who reviewed the documentation described the compliance concern as minor, the kind of administrative discrepancy that veteran players with established organizational infrastructure resolve quietly and quickly through their management teams without their name ever appearing in a news cycle. Eala, still building that infrastructure, still navigating the gap between junior phenom and fully supported professional, did not have the institutional armor that protects established stars from exactly this kind of exposure. And the WTA, rather than extending the discretion it routinely offered to players with greater commercial profiles and longer organizational histories, allowed the situation to achieve maximum public visibility at minimum benefit to anyone involved. The Philippine media reported it. International tennis outlets picked it up. Social media assembled the fragments into a narrative that was simultaneously unfair and unstoppable, because once a compliance story attaches itself to an athlete's name in the public consciousness, the absence of wrongdoing rarely receives the same coverage as the initial allegation. Eala handled it with the composure that has defined every chapter of her public life. She made no inflammatory statements, her team communicated professionally and factually, she continued competing. But the damage to her reputation in certain media circles was real. The association of her name with institutional irregularity, however unjustified the underlying substance, created a narrative cloud that followed her into press conferences and colored coverage in ways that her actual performance on court had never once warranted. And in Mallorca, watching from a distance that suddenly felt very close, Rafael Nadal received detailed accounts of everything that had transpired. What happened next was not impulsive. It was considered, deliberate, and executed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what his withdrawal would communicate, and to whom. The invitation had arrived through proper channels weeks before the controversy erupted. A prominent WTA event, the kind that attracts significant media attention, draws considerable commercial interest, and benefits enormously from the association of legendary names with its programming, had extended a formal request for Nadal's participation in an ambassadorial capacity. Appearances at this level carry weight far beyond the hours involved. A single Nadal presence at a WTA event generates coverage, elevates the occasion's perceived significance, and sends a message to sponsors and broadcasters that this is something worth attending to. The WTA knew this, the invitation reflected that knowledge, and Nadal's initial response had been, by all accounts, positive. His schedule permitted it, his genuine commitment to the growth of women's tennis, documented across years of public statements and private actions, made the participation feel natural and appropriate. Then the Eala situation unfolded. The timeline of Nadal's withdrawal, cross-referenced against the sequence of public events surrounding Eala's compliance exposure, is not ambiguous. The decision to decline the invitation came within days of the story reaching its peak media visibility. The proximity was not coincidental, and no one involved in communicating his withdrawal suggested it was. His representative's communication to the WTA was described by sources familiar with its contents as direct, professional, and unambiguous in its reasoning. Nadal was not withdrawing due to scheduling conflicts. He was not withdrawing for health reasons or personal circumstances. He was withdrawing because he found the manner in which the WTA had handled the situation involving Alex Eala to be incompatible with his willingness to lend his name and presence to their platform. Those words, arriving in a formal communication from the representative of a 22-time Grand Slam champion, landed with the force of a verdict. The WTA's response internally was described as alarmed, not because Nadal's absence would devastate the event logistically, the tournament would proceed regardless, but because the symbolic weight of his withdrawal transformed a contained controversy into a story with legs. When Rafael Nadal, who has spent his post-competitive years as a careful, measured ambassador for tennis broadly, decides an organization's behavior has crossed a threshold he cannot publicly associate with, every journalist covering the sport immediately understands the magnitude of that judgment. Tennis media began reporting the withdrawal within 48 hours. The connection to Eala was explicit in every account. Nadal's camp did not contradict the framing, which, in the careful language of sports public relations, constitutes confirmation. Former players began offering commentary. Several who had experienced the WTA's administrative culture firsthand and who had previously maintained diplomatic silence about their frustrations with it found in Nadal's withdrawal the permission structure to speak with greater candor. The collective picture that emerged was of an organization that applied its procedural power inconsistently, with discretion and gentleness towards players with commercial leverage and with visible rigidity towards those without it. Eala, for all her cultural significance and competitive trajectory, occupied an administratively vulnerable position. She wasn't yet cracking the top 20 consistently. Her commercial infrastructure, while growing rapidly, lacked the established organizational machinery that surrounds veterans with decades of relationship building behind them. In the WTA's internal power geography, she was still becoming, not yet arrived. And the manner in which the organization handled her compliance matter reflected that status with depressing fidelity. The Philippine government's engagement added a dimension that transformed the story from a tennis governance dispute into a matter of international diplomatic attention. Philippine sports officials, members of the National Olympic Committee, and at least 2 sitting legislators issued formal statements demanding transparency from the WTA regarding its treatment of the country's most celebrated active athlete. When sovereign governments begin making formal inquiries about how an international sports organization treated one of their citizens, the conversation has definitively outgrown the category of internal administrative matter. Sponsors associated with the WTA event from which Nadal had withdrawn began receiving pointed questions from their own communications teams about the reputational context of their association. Corporate partners of the tour, quietly and without public announcement, began requesting private briefings about the situation and its trajectory. The financial implications of sustained reputational damage were becoming visible in real time. Meanwhile, Eala's public profile, already elevated by months of extraordinary commercial performance and the Federer funding controversy, reached a level of global recognition that no marketing campaign could engineer. She was, involuntarily but undeniably, the most discussed figure in women's tennis, and the discussion was overwhelmingly sympathetic. The institution that had sought to apply its procedures uniformly had instead produced its own most damaging crisis in years, and the man whose absence catalyzed that crisis was watching from Mallorca with the particular quiet of someone who had said everything that needed to be said without opening his mouth once. Step outside the commercial narrative for a moment. Set aside the contract figures and the market data and the corporate strategy documents. Look at 2 young women. Coco Gauff, 21 years old, who has spent more than a third of her conscious life being a public symbol of excellence and possibility for communities that needed her to succeed as badly as she needed it for herself. who has navigated the intersection of athletic pressure and racial representation and commercial expectation and political visibility with a grace that most adults with decades of experience could not sustain, who sat in front of cameras and broke, not because she was weak, but because she had been carrying something genuinely too heavy for too long without anyone acknowledging the weight. Alex Eala, 20 years old, who grew up dreaming of courts she could barely access, who earned every opportunity through relentless, unglamorous work, who became a pioneer without choosing the burden of pioneering, and who now finds her name attached to another young woman's pain through no action of her own, navigating the particular discomfort of being celebrated for something that hurt someone she respects. Neither of them created the system that produced this outcome. Both of them are subject to it completely. Both of them deserve better from it than it has provided. The truth this story reveals about professional women's tennis in 2025 is not primarily about Alex Eala's commercial power or Coco Gauff's vulnerability. It is about a commercial ecosystem that has never adequately reckoned with the human cost of how it builds, elevates, and occasionally discards the young women whose labor and talent constitute its entire reason for existence. Athletes are not brands. They contain brands, temporarily, provisionally, in the specific way that living human beings contain any external identity temporarily attached to them. When the brand is elevated above the person, when the commercial construction is treated as more real than the human reality beneath it, the system creates fragility that eventually produces exactly the kind of public fracture the world witnessed in that press conference. Gauff's breakdown was not a moment of weakness, it was a moment of honesty that the commercial architecture surrounding her had consistently prevented. The mask slipped, not because she failed, but because the mask had been in place for too long, under too much pressure, and no amount of training prepares you for the specific moment when the institution you trusted most withdraws that trust without adequate warning. The reform this moment demands is not complicated in concept, however difficult in execution. Athletes deserve contractual protections that acknowledge their human investment in commercial partnerships. Governing bodies and corporate partners have responsibilities that extend beyond the transactional. The people whose excellence generates billions in commercial value deserve to be treated as partners in that value creation, not as assets to be repositioned when the analytics shift. Gauff will recover. She's too talented, too resilient, and too fundamentally exceptional for this moment to define her career trajectory. Other brands will recognize what Adidas briefly obscured, that her commercial appeal is built on authentic cultural resonance that outlasts any single contract cycle. Eala will continue ascending. The commercial validation, however it arrived, represents confirmation of something that was always present in her game, her character, and her story. Both of them deserve a system that sees them fully, not as market opportunities or demographic targets or commercial franchises, as the extraordinary young women they have always, completely, undeniably been. So sit with this question as you move through your day. When the industry that profits most from young women's excellence is also the industry most capable of breaking them, who is ultimately responsible for changing that? And are we, as the audience that funds the entire ecosystem through our attention and our purchases, as innocent as we'd prefer to believe? Coco Gauff broke down because the weight became unbearable. Not because she was fragile, but because the load was never proportionate to any human being's capacity to carry it indefinitely. She carried it longer than most could have. She carried it beautifully, publicly, and at enormous personal cost. Alex Eala arrived in the middle of that weight and became involuntarily part of its final unbearable increment. She did not seek that role. She would not have chosen it, but she handled the complexity of occupying it with the specific, quiet dignity that has characterized every chapter of her public life. The $50 million will find a new home. Contracts will be restructured and re-signed. The commercial machinery will continue turning with the indifference to human cost that defines all machinery operating at sufficient scale. What cannot be restructured is what that press conference moment revealed about the human reality beneath the commercial surface of professional women's tennis. That reality deserved witnessing, it deserved honest conversation, and it deserves the kind of systemic response that transforms a viral moment of vulnerability into lasting, meaningful protection for every young champion who comes after. Both Coco Gauff and Alex Eala are writing legacies that will outlast every contract, every controversy, and every corporate calculation made at their expense. The question is whether the industry surrounding them will evolve fast enough to deserve them. Drop your perspective below. Did Adidas betray Coco Gauff? Does Alex Eala deserve everything coming her way? And what does this moment demand from professional sport? This conversation belongs to you. Subscribe right now for the stories that go beneath the surface of women's tennis, the power, the pain, the politics, and the human truth that the official channels will never fully tell. We are just beginning.